Welcome to the Evolving Performance Podcast. The goal of this podcast is to share practical insights to maximize sport performance, durability, training adaptation, and career longevity. Today, I'm excited to have Eric Cressey on the podcast. Eric is the Director of Player Health and Performance for the New York Yankees and the President and Co-founder of Cressey Sports Performance, with facilities in Hudson, Massachusetts and Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. Eric has published 5 books and co-created 4 DVD sets that have been sold in over 60 countries around the world. He's been an invited guest speaker in 6 countries in over 20 U.S. states. He serves on the Health Advisory Board for Equinox and is a baseball consultant to New Balance. Eric's work has been featured in media channels such as Men's Health, Men's Fitness, ESPN, The Wall Street Journal, MLB Network, The New York Times, The Tim Ferriss Show, MLB.com, and Yahoo Sports, among others. In this episode, we discuss the importance of developing maximum strength for athletes and key characteristics of effective strength training methods, how to recognize when an athlete is strong enough and ready to pursue other primary training goals, if strength training can lead to reduced mobility, training considerations for rotational athletes, and how strength training should evolve from off-season to in-season programs to account for competing demands. Now, please welcome to the show, Eric Cressey. Cool. Eric, welcome to the podcast. Excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me, dude. Good to see you.
Yeah, for sure. So my goal for today is to really do a deep dive on strength training for athletes. And you not only wrote a book titled Maximum Strength, but also are an accomplished powerlifter and currently probably setting the bar for dad strength a little too high for the rest of us. But you've also developed and worked with a ton of really high-level baseball players, which is a sport that relies heavily on rotational speed and precision. So to kick things off here, can you just talk about why strength work is important for athletes?
Yeah, I always talk about, let me preface it by saying you mentioned powerlifting background. I have every reason possible with my own background to be biased towards maximal strength development, right? And that's been something I probably fought early in my career more so than now. But yeah, I always use the analogy maximum strength is a glass, right? It's the foundation. It's the glass that you can put all those other athletic qualities in, whether it's joint stability, whether it's power development, whether it's muscular endurance, you might roll out more than, a conditioning sport, something like hockey. Right? Guys don't have, shifts in baseball like they do in hockey. So maybe there's a little bit more of a place for it in that world from that dynamic. Big picture is maximum strength is a foundation for a lot of things. You and I both worked with a lot of those, 13, 14-year-old kids who are loosey-goosey. Maybe they haven't gone through their growth spurt. They have no idea where their body is in space. And you take that kid and you teach him to do a quality lunge with 50 pounds in each hand. You get him to trap bar deadlift, 275 or something like that. All of a sudden, things just magically get better, independent of all the other stuff you're doing. They're maybe playing multiple sports and, maybe they're going through speed development training, stuff like that. But, strength does make some of those other qualities more sticky. I think, we'll probably talk about it today. It's that you get into trouble with it when we realize we're in the wrong spot on the bell curve. Is a little bit is good, getting to a pretty, good critical threshold to enhance all those other qualities is important. But when you start selling out for it, yeah, there are negative consequences. And it also pushes out some things that we could probably train that are more advantageous for us.
It's interesting. You mentioned strength is the foundation for other qualities. I think that's a more intuitive concept if you look at a quality like power, but probably less so a quality like conditioning. And I'd think back, this was probably, 10, 12 years ago at this point, but we had a really tall female basketball player that was, I think she was a senior in high school and had never strength trained before and was just really, really weak. And we did a conditioning test with her and her heart rate shot through the roof. And it wasn't, watching her go, it wasn't that her conditioning was actually as bad as the heart rate response indicated. It's just that every stride she was almost redlining, her ability to support her own body weight. And, a couple strength training sessions where she has a little more control, a little better neural input, that the conditioning response actually improved quite a bit. So it's interesting the carryover effect that can have.
I think it's fascinating. They feed each other, right? Like we've always, it's funny. I started up like a new client today, like guy who's been super successful college golfer. Work capacity was not good. Movement quality was actually excellent. It's like, hey man, this is a guy who are like just a little bit of aerobic based stuff could be absolutely life changing for him, right? 2 sessions a week at 70% of max heart rate for 30 minutes changes the context of what we could do in a typical session for him over the course of the next, 4 to 6 months. Conversely, it goes the other way around, right? You have someone who might have a, very, very good cardiovascular profile and they just can't handle that 6 to 8 times body weight and ground reaction forces on every sprint. So it's wild how everything is very, very circular like that.
You just alluded to this, but over the last decade or so, it seems like there's been a shift in the industry away from chasing more and more max strength in favor of emphasizing more speed and power work. And I think that shift is really centered around the question of how strong is strong enough, for an individual athlete in an individual situation. And, at a certain level of strength, there may be higher risk or, at a minimum, just diminished returns in terms of sport performance for continuing to invest the time, energy, resources into chasing those marginal gains. So, how do you go about deciding if an athlete will benefit from continuing to pursue strength as a primary training goal, or, if they've kind of reached a point in their development where they should shift their focus?
Yeah, I think, the first thing I'd say is technology has helped us a ton with this, right? Like, I think when we were having these conversations, 15 years ago, we didn't, maybe they were out there, but they were not accessible and they were not affordable. We didn't have like the level of force plate awareness where you can go and buy a really high level of force plate for $5 or $6,000. Whereas in the past, it was probably well into six figures, and it was not nearly as nuanced in the data you got. Like, we didn't have a crazy amount of velocity based training devices where we could actually track this stuff. Like, we were kind of just using like the Just Jump mat and like working backwards from it and thinking that it could really help us. We've got access to things like Proteus that look at how we test rotationally, and things like a 1080 that can, basically look at, differential leg contributions during sprinting and stuff like that. So I think tech has really made a lot of that stuff not just easier to interpret, but it's made us more likely to reconsider how we used to do things. I think also just, I can't speak to hockey, that's your world, but I can definitely speak to baseball. It's like average fastball velocity has gone up year after year after year after year. Body weight for players went up like linear for an extended period of time. The game is played at ridiculously high levels. Like, if you go look at the top 30 tennis players in the world, I bet you'd find one guy who's under 6 feet tall. Like, they all are freak athletes. NFL, it's like a car accident on every play. Like, sports just in general are played at such a high level that I think what we're actually seeing is that we're seeing like a larger gap between the lower performers and the high performers. And I think that's in baseball why we're seeing more games that are, starter goes 4 innings and then the bullpen covers 5. It's a bunch of guys who all come in and throw 12 pitches at 95 to 100, where in the old days, like, they'd leave a starter out there at 88 to 91 miles an hour. He'd pitch till the 7th and they'd bring in, one guy to throw the last 2 innings. The game is just so specialized. And because performance has gotten heightened like that, which is for the better of your enjoyment, obviously, has injury risks and certainly like that. I think people have been more open to doing things differently. Like, you can't watch Jacob deGrom throw a ball 102 miles an hour on his frame and be like, well, if he deadlifted 600, he'd throw out 112. Like, clearly that there's something that he's doing in terms of his ability to access positions and utilize the fascial system for force production. Like, we're seeing a lot of these guys who are doing very, very impressive things without being like, I hate to call them muscle bound, but like power lifter builds that we expected them to have to be back in the day. So I think we do have more opportunities to observe people who are thriving at a really high level of performance without fitting the traditional mold. Everything was just very homogenous in terms of how an athlete looked. If you go back and watch like the Sosa McGuire documentary, when those guys were having the home run like race, every pitcher was like a stock righty throwing 87 to 89, and like they didn't look different. Now we see guys that are doing crazy stuff from all different arm angles. They're all different builds. Like, big leaguers come in all shapes and sizes.
And so, you mentioned a few different pieces of technology and the fact that, people are built different, that there's different strategies that are used to create that high level performance. Are you really just looking at each individual athlete on a kind of one-off basis and trying to interpret where their performance is, what some of those numbers look like from a training standpoint, what their injury history and structural health looks like, and then deciding how you want to design the training program from a strength standpoint? Or are you relying more on, loose set thresholds of saying, this guy reaches a certain level of output relative to his body weight on a force plate measure, then we know that their strength is adequate and we can, move on to more of an emphasis on other qualities?
Yeah, for sure. Let's use this as an example. Like, we use Hawkins force plates. They're awesome. If someone walks in and jumps a 2.75 peak velocity in terms of meters per second, like, they're probably not going to move very fast. Like, it'd be a very low percentile for our professional athletes, very low for our college athletes. So when you look at that number, and ultimately what we do in the weight room is to enhance athletic performance, keep them healthy, all that stuff. A 2.75, is that a dude that's squatting 500 and is just slower than death? Is that a dude who's just overweight and has too much weight to overcome and needs to be leaner? Is it an athlete that is just, basically fundamentally weak? They can't put any force in the ground, and they're literally like, their glass is like filled to the max. That's all the power they can have. That's like your freshman college volleyball player, right? So you wrestle with it. And then I think what it does is it becomes like this Venn diagram of development, right? Where if that 2.75 is a guy that really, really needs the weight room, but his range of motion is terrible, like you have to think about what's the consequence of me taking that athlete and throwing a bunch of squats, deadlifts, bench presses, whatever it is at him. Like, is there going to be a price to be paid where, he's going to get very, very compressed and maybe lose something that's made him successful, right? Or what happens if that guy's 37 years old and just trying to eke out a year or two on the tail end of his career? Like, what are the avenues for helping him along? So I always joke, it's like a different casserole for every athlete. You've got to figure out what the price to be paid is. It's like having someone who's got terrible shoulder mobility and then you realize they had a shoulder replacement. Are you going to try to, pound through that hardware and make it better? Or are you going to figure out other ways that they can get the job done and, talk about activity modification and all that? It's like anything else. You do the assessment to figure out what your next step is, and more importantly, what the cost of that next step is.
And that's actually a great segue. You mentioned the muscle bound aspect of, some of the more traditional powerlifting builds. And, I think one of the big fears from athletes getting stronger is that it will somehow limit their mobility or their athleticism, their movement efficiency. Do you think there's any merit to that concern? And, if so, what are some strategies that you've used to help athletes improve strength if they need it without while minimizing the potential loss in those areas?
Yeah, for sure. So the first thing I would say is my perspective has definitely changed. Like I would have said it's an old wives' tale, back in the day. I think, Bill Hartman, credit to him, has done some really great educational work around the idea of people. There's a price to pay for people. Like certain people will adapt more unfavorably to load. Like here's what I can tell you. Like everyone has seen like a hypermobile athlete where they come in, they do a strength training session and they leave feeling like $1 million. The aches and pains go away. They feel like they're moving more efficiently. Just they're more present and more alert. Everything about it makes them better. Right. And then we've also seen that stiff athlete that comes in and does a training session and it's almost like they hold an electrical charge for the next, day or two. They feel stiff, like they don't bounce back between sessions, all that. Here's what I can tell you. I'm 43 years old. I turn 44 next week. Like I lifted really heavy stuff for a long time. Like, so I was a tennis and soccer player, rotational athlete, played baseball, played a bunch of sports growing up. And then, I basically just lifted a lot of really heavy stuff for an extended period of time. Like, I don't rotate like I used to. And it's been interesting, like trying to get back into tennis here in my 40s, just as like kind of like a once a week hobby and stuff like that. Like you just can't get into some of the same positions. Like I can't throw myself into lumbar extension and hit a kick serve to like the ad court like I used to when I was a high school tennis player. I have lost range of motion, but that was needed for my new sport, right? You don't want to have a ton of degrees of freedom when you've got 500 pounds on your back or 600 pounds in your hand. So there definitely is a price to be paid. Probably beats up on cartilage a little bit more. But I think the biggest thing is that the loss of rotational capacity for a lot of people is significant at those kinds of heavy bilateral loads. Now, it's a different discussion if we're talking about rotational rows, kettlebell, Turkish get-ups, single leg stuff. When that weight training is velocity-based stuff, we're focusing on moving fast. We're finding exercises like it's a split stance low cable row with an alternate arm reach where I'm coaching kind of rib rotation throughout it. Like there are ways where I think we can hold on to motion as we get athletes stronger in ways that are specific to their sport. But I think we'd be really naive to say that there isn't a price to be paid for absolutely everything. And probably the best example I can give for you is that this can work. So like my best deadlift was 660 at a body weight of 180. Like, and you can kind of do the math on it. Like there aren't a whole lot of people that walk around at over 800 pounds and have good orthopedic health. It usually doesn't work. They usually lay in bed all day, but I popped a meniscus. I finished a set of squatting, went to take a a barbell, plate off a barbell and racket on the adjacent one. I popped my meniscus. It was Christmas Eve, 2020. Not good situation. Had it repaired. It was a big old one in January of 21. And what I'll tell you is nowadays, if I lift anything over 500 pounds, my knee just talks to me. And it just tells me like, don't go further. There's no benefit to be had. Like your wife won't like you anymore. Your kids won't like you anymore. It won't make you more business. It won't make your business successful, but there's an outrageous amount of downside. But here's the interesting thing about it. You could basically say that my maximal strength in the context of a deadlift is atrophied by probably 200%. I'm very okay with that. Maybe a little bit less than that. All my force plate numbers have gotten better. My body weight hasn't changed. My ability to hold on to muscle mass hasn't changed. I orthopedically feel quite a bit better. Like, frankly, if I go out and sprint, have a lot of arm swing, change directions, be athletic, play ultimate frisbee, or even just like throw the softball with my daughters, everything feels better. So like, I think I'm just at a different point on the bell curve of strength. Like, I've gotten all those adaptations. And I think you and I can probably both agree that the two athletic qualities that stick around the most, maximal strength and aerobic capacity. Yet everybody wants to lift really heavy stuff and, walk at a low intensity, when in reality, like, it's probably like some of that anaerobic stuff and the power development stuff that we really have to attack the best. And it's just lessons I've learned over the years. And I'm a sample size of one, but there are plenty of athletes out there that I'm sure have learned the same thing.
Yeah. And at the age that your kids are getting to, you're probably hitting a point where you actually have to work really hard to keep up with them. That not, you can outpace the 3 and 4 year olds a little easier than when they start to hit the 10.
But even beyond that, I'm sure there have been days when you've been on your feet coaching a ton and you did a heavy lift and you went home and all you wanted to do was sit on the floor and play with your daughter. It's like, man, I do not want to sit crisscross applesauce right now. Like, my hips are just not feeling this. Like, I'll just lay on my side instead. Like, we all get to that point. So you've got to shift your focus a little bit. You got to prioritize mobility. Like, ultimately, that's the stuff that preserves an athlete's career a lot more. Like, if you're 38 years old and still going strong in the NHL, God bless you. Like, I don't really care what your back squat is.
Yeah. Well, let's lean into the exercise selection aspect a little bit. So, obviously working in baseball, you work with athletes that primarily move horizontally and lean heavily on rotational patterns. When it comes to their actual strength work, Eric, is that something that you account for in exercise selection, or are those types of patterns and force vectors more things that you try to integrate in things that fall in the speed and power bucket?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think, warm up stuff, you're going to see athletes that are throwing med balls, using the 3D strap. They're chasing mobility drills, things like that to work on that. Whether that's chasing them through alignment, finding some posterior tilt of the pelvis to free up 10 degrees of IR, or even some manual therapy, or banded joint distractions, any of those different things, and then trying to integrate it a little bit more thereafter. I mean, I'll say a few things to that. First off, even after all these years, I'm still stunned that people can throw med balls as much as they do. Like, you can throw 6 to 8 sets at athletes 6 days a week and they handle it no problem. Like, we've seen some of the same stuff when we've integrated Proteus using like the Ancore. We can do some stuff on the 1080. Like, there's all these different ways to use various equipment and technology to attack it. So we attack rotation a lot. I think I'm maybe less concerned about like, all right, you're a right-handed hitter. We're going to do 4 sets on your left and 2 sets on your right. I think these things are probably better handled through other stuff. I think the force plate drives a lot more of our interventions that might be a little bit more asymmetrical, along with our movement screens, stuff like that. But no, I think it can be a lot of different things. We might use it with complex training where, do some kind of heavy loading, and then you're doing a hiding for distance, and then a 4-pound rotational med ball scoop toss, something to that effect. So there's a lot of different ways to attack it. I think the biggest takeaway is that you have to do it regularly, and you have to recognize that if it's accompanying a lot of like your classic bilateral stuff in this population, beginners are going to handle it no problem. Some of your more advanced athletes, you might have to be a little bit more targeted with what you do.
That might be a good transition point into the next question I had for you, which is, there's been a lot of attention paid over the last 2 decades to the, comparing and contrasting the benefits and risks of bilateral versus unilateral lower body lifts. Where do you stand on the balance of these in a program for athletes? And has your perspective on this, kind of changed and evolved over the course of your career?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm still decidedly like in the middle. I think I tend to be very method agnostic. It's probably something that served me well over the years, but it's nutrition or training styles or whatever it may be, even, the type of equipment we use. There's different people that will thrive with different things. Like, I know I've always heard that, like, bilateral exercises are more dangerous and things like that. And then you see a kid who came in and he tried to reverse lunge 315 and his SI joint's never been the same. I think those are probably the discussions that, I'm a little bit more of. Like, some people with like a chronic patellar tendinopathy don't do great with single leg exercises, your classic split squats and lunges and things like that. And, maybe you spend a little bit more time, bilateral posterior chain, you come back to it and it's great. So I don't think that I'm ever going to fall to like one end of the spectrum. Like I know a lot of people that feel really, really good when you teach them to do a good goblet squat, like the pelvic positioning that comes about from it. Even if you need to use a slant board or some kind of heel lift to get them there to like recapture those patterns, there's a lot of really good things that happen. I think also like, are we training the pattern or are we loading the pattern? Like go to Asia and you see a whole lot of people in a deep squat position smoking cigarettes on every street corner. Like they live there. Like it's a pattern that they've held on to. Like we get a lot of players from the Far East that'll come over here for, 1 to 4 week stints. And it's amazing. Like these athletes typically, particularly the Japanese players, they all hold on to that pattern really, really well. They generally tend to be like narrow infrasternal angle athletes who just are very conditioned to deep squat well. But if you take one of those wide ISA guys and use the right exercise and you get them, some of that, sacral counter nutation, you make their squats more squatty, they do feel a lot better. And you do get a lot more, downstream effects, whether it's, hip rotation, range of motion, or even just like getting rid of diffuse low back pain, recapturing from some thoracic spine rotation. Good things do happen.
So you mentioned that you're method agnostic. And, I think that when you work in a lot of different environments, there's different resources available to you. You're kind of forced into a position where, you have to look at what the stimulus is more so than, what the equipment is or, what a specific exercise might look like. And on that note, when you're programming specifically for strength, what are some of the characteristics of the exercise or the programming that you feel like you need to, what boxes do you need to check to make sure it's an effective strength stimulus? Is that, specific set and rep ranges you gravitate towards, controlling rest periods, working at percentage of 1 rep maxes, touching things a certain number of times per week? What are some of the things that you look for there?
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on, are we trying to build it or are we trying to maintain it? It takes more volume, a greater focus on a specific intensity range. I think if we are trying to build, like, I do think you need to take a weights above 90% of 1 rep max if you're trying to build true maximal strength. Keep in mind, that's not just squatting, deadlifting. That could be your isometric recruitment on like a, mid-thigh pull or some kind of like split stance rack deadlift or something to that effect. With that said, though, that doesn't always work for people orthopedically. Like sometimes you may need to take an athlete and give them a little bit less load and saying, just move this faster than 0.7 meters per second. And we're going to get a little bit more of a carryover. So I think it depends a lot. If the loading's really, really heavy, the volume probably has to be low. Maybe that's a 2 sets of 3 versus if you have an athlete that isn't training at that same high intensity and you're trying to like get a kind of a trickle down effect to max strength by moving a bar fast. Maybe that's an athlete who's more like a 5x3 or something like that at 75% of 1 rep max. So I think you can attack it via different avenues. I will say, in the interest of like talking more about like how I've evolved, like it takes very little volume to maintain strength. Like that's something for me with my powerlifting background. Like I remember having a conversation actually with Jeff Volek, who was one of my professors at University of Connecticut, one of the premier low carbohydrate diet research guys out there. But a lot of people know he was like an Indiana State powerlifting champ, like did some incredible things, as a lifter himself. And I just remember him, he was, married and kind of moving on in life. He's like, it's incredible. He's like, I can just go in and do like 1 set of 4 squat, bench, deadlift, and my strength just sticks around, even if I just do it like once a month. And I've seen that as well. Like you can really tap into a high percentage of it. So we're talking about in-season athletes. Man, like 2 sets of 3 every 3rd week can do some powerful things for some guys. Like if they just tickle it here and there, it's all going to carry over. What's nice is that when you can space it out like that and you have regular force plate numbers to kind of tell you that things are good from a force standpoint, they're holding the qualities and the body weight that you want them to, like you're not using those bullets. So they don't leave the session feeling banged up. You can work on all the other stuff. That's been the stuff that's really, really eye-opening for me, particularly in our veteran athletes, like watching guys that are in their mid 30s and we've got 4 or 5 years of jump date on them where 31 might be their prime, like or the tail end of their prime. And then, as they're starting to drift off, it's amazing that these guys, some of them can do, 1 20-minute session a week and still hold all of their force numbers. It's pretty incredible, but it's in part because they are doing so many athletic things on a daily basis, playing baseball, right? There's a lot of ground reaction forces, sprinting and swinging and throwing that eventually carry over. I
just want to circle back to, stimulus every 3 to 4 weeks or so can be effective for maintaining strength. With the athletes that you work with, I'm assuming that they're not only training once every 3 to 4 weeks,
Correct.
that there's some touch points. So I just want to, can
Yeah.
Can you like fill in the gaps between those, higher threshold?
Yeah, for sure. It might be
days?
more your classic assistance exercises, or it's that same like kind of compound exercise, just moved for for more velocity. Maybe they're on a VBT device or something to that effect. It's a little bit more volume driven, right? Because there's benefits from that too, right? You get obviously glucose disposal, we get immune function, we get greater androgen receptor content in target tissues. We get all those good things that strength training delivers beyond just, muscle mass muscular strength. So we want to have a trickle down effect to a number of different systems when we train these guys.
Yeah. And I think, anybody that's trained has had the experience of not doing either training at all or doing a specific exercise for long periods of time. And then when they come back to it, they're really sore afterwards. And, I think particularly in season, that may be a benefit of, even if you're not loading a pattern in a way that's going to drive a specific adaptation, just touching it allows you to be less sore and have, a lower cost of adaptation when you hit it, at a higher load or higher speed down the road.
Exercise has a protective effect. Like throwing a ton of variety at guys in season, making something new up every day is it's a race to the bottom. So you do have to have consistent stuff. And players are different. You have some guys that want something new every 4 weeks just because it, in-season training can sometimes get a little bit monotonous for guys. The last thing they maybe want to do after a, lengthy road trip, especially if we're on the road and the weight room's not well equipped or something like that. So, some guys want it more frequent. Other guys are just creatures of habit. They might run a program for 2.5 months. And those guys obviously have very little concern for having any kind of soreness. You also got to figure out where you integrate it, right? Like, if you have a starting pitcher who's on a 5-day rotation, he's going to have a 6-day rotation sometime. Like there's a day to go to something new. If he's going to go on short rest, that's a terrible time to integrate it. And sometimes we'll do like an introduction week deload where like we give them a new program and we just do the exercises at less volume and less intensity, get accustomed to it. And then they come back, they do it again. You never really get any soreness. It works its way out. Like the worst thing you can do, like, as you probably know, is like, hey, we're going to go 3 sets of 8 walking lunges and 3 sets of 10 stiff leg deadlifts. And like, see you tomorrow. Like it's generally not going to go well. And neither of us are going to be employed for very long if guys are sore all the time in season.
So, I think of all the conversations I've had with youth athletes over the years where they're like, I can't train today. I've got a game tomorrow. And, I don't want to be sore. I don't want to be fatigued. And then I think of the pro baseball schedule that you have to navigate. And there really aren't, correct me if I'm wrong here, but roughly 18 days off, days without games across 6 months, some of which you might be traveling or, relocating and changing time zones and et cetera, that has its own recovery cost. How do you space out strength work in season for the baseball guys that, accounting for the other competing demands that they're navigating?
Yeah, for sure. I can give you a little glimpse into the baseball schedule. So for context, we played a getaway game yesterday in Seattle with a red-eye flight back. The off day today, 7:05 game tomorrow. So it's a pretty quick turnaround. The lockout year was a particularly interesting one. There was a period where there was like a work stoppage in baseball and the season got pushed back a little bit and they needed to make up 2 series. So they basically shortened the All-Star break and added some double headers. And so coming out of the All-Star break, which normally is 4 days, it became 3. We played a double header in Houston, flew overnight to Baltimore. I think it was a 6:40 start the next game. So we actually played 3 games in 2 different time zones in under 24 hours. I'm not sure it's ever done. We had a player actually suffered a pretty significant elbow injury. He threw in a game in Houston and in Baltimore. So it goes to show you like baseball calendar is different. Like love you, love our NBA friends, our NFL guys. And I know you guys have the longest, I think, competitive season. It just goes forever. The hard part in baseball is buying somebody a day is impossible because those innings have to be picked up by somebody else. You're always just kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul. So it's, I joke, it's probably 200 games in 230 days from the start of spring training all the way to the end. We played 48 games in 51 days at one point. You play multiple games in a doubleheader. And those are the ones that actually sometimes crush you because a lot of times if you have a 3-game series on a weekend where, your Friday night game and let's say your Saturday game, there's rain. So you're like waiting around the facility all day. So you have this, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. day and you never actually get the game in. You got to come back the next day and do a double header. Those are the ones that really, really crush athletes. So big picture, baseball is a lot of games. There's a lot of debate about whether cutting the schedule back would be a good move or expanding rosters to have a little bit more flexibility. It's got a little tougher over the years too. They've limited the number of options that major league players can have. They can only have 5 a season. So like in the olden days, you could just send relief pitchers up and down anytime that happened. Now you can only do that 5 times per year before they're subjected to to basically get picked up by another team on waivers. So the game has changed quite a bit, particularly at the level of performance that's taking place. So what it all speaks to is, you are always balancing performance with longer term development and like holding on to those physical qualities. And that's the sweet spot, right? It's investing in, recovery and nutritional strategies and talking to athletes about sleep and hydration and all those different things. But at the same time, you recognize that at times you do have to be the stressor by throwing something at them, because the long-term adaptations that you're holding on to are going to be really important to what they're trying to do. I don't know if that answered your question. I rambled a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you will, when the guys are playing games, sometimes 2 a day, but let's just call it every day, because that's essentially what it is for them. I imagine minimizing soreness is important, but keeping training consistently present throughout the year is important as well. So
guys, I was just saying, guys go in 2 different ways on it, right? Like there are some guys that want to come in and do it first thing. Like they get to the facility and everybody's going to have like their daily prep stuff and all that. Hitters are going to have early work and, pitchers are going to have stuff. But like some guys just want to come in and get their lift in early in the day. Usually those are more position players, relief pitchers, or starting pitchers on their off days. But there are also guys that'll always want to do it after a game. So a relief pitcher throws in a game, he's going to come right in. He's going to be lifting while the game's still going on. You might see a position player that, is going to, sneak in a quick lift at the end of a game. They literally just like come in, take their uniform off. Like sometimes they're even doing their lift in like their shower sandals, right? It's just something to like batch it a little bit. Another thing guys will do a lot is they like to lift right before an off day. So if we're playing a Sunday afternoon 1:00 game and we know we have Monday off, a lot of guys will come in and lift on a Sunday just because it's a chance to kind of consolidate stress, knowing you've got that little bubble there. I think one of the other things that we have, it's a really debated point in the industry. Like if you look at GPS data on baseball players, there are a lot of guys that are running in excess of 90% of their max 6 to 7 days a week. Like it's just the nature. It's very different than any other sport. Like the only time you approximate that is when you have like an NFL head coach that wants to run his guys got into the ground during the week during practice. But in baseball, you hit a lot of it. So it's actually very hard to do a lot of supplemental speed work with your everyday players. Like, yes, you need to train your guy who's going to come off the bench and pinch run in the 8th or be a defensive replacement who might be your 5th outfielder, but it's hard to do a lot of that stuff. The game itself does account for a lot of stuff and maybe pushes some other things that other sports have to worry about.
How do you account for the injury history and that trade-off of trying to continue to maintain a strength stimulus, but minimize the long-term wear and tear and the durability concerns of athletes?
Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with a conversation with the athlete, right? Like, are there movements that are hard-nosed for you, things that would provoke you? Like, have you never done well with deadlifting, right? Squatting doesn't feel good on your hip. Like, we're not going to use bullets there. So I think those discussions are really, really helpful. And I think also like, asking them where they feel like they need to get better. Like those are very important discussions because, they may not be aware of things that really could help them as well. Yeah, everything always starts with a conversation and has to be individualized in that regard.
And then are there any specific nutrition, supplementation, even, training recovery strategies that you really try to emphasize with guys that, we're trying to improve their strength?
Yeah, I mean, I think sleep is always top tier, particularly in a sport like baseball. It's hard. Like your guys and my guys, they go to work at 7:00 at night. Like it's just a very different world than the rest of the population. If you're a morning person and you got to go to work at 7:00 at night, you better get good at napping. And then you also need to learn how to like sleep in just a little bit. So I think, if there's one thing I've really prioritized over the years, it's more so now than I probably did when I first, got going in this industry, is like I have way more conversations on sleep. It's interesting. Like the number one thing they've shown you can do to help with sleep is to just talk about it. Like make athletes know it's okay to sleep in, to like have sleep extension. That goes a long way. Counsel them on like good bedroom environment, getting away from technology, turning off the TV, maybe have something that's noise canceling, whether it's a fan or like one of those apps, like make it cold. All those different things can go a long way. I think the thing we also see in baseball, it's tough, is like you see a lot of guys that consume caffeine like late in the day. And like, yeah, exercise shortens the half-life of caffeine, but you'll see guys that are just wired at like, 11:30 at night. It's always interesting seeing guys like going through recovery stuff like close to midnight. It's like, there's nothing that's better for recovery than just going home and like get your dinner and go home and sleep. Like that's the stuff that's important. So sleep, nutrition, hydration are always going to be top tier. I'm a big believer in manual therapy. I know you're an LMT too. Like that's in your wheelhouse. Huge benefits to that side of things. We're fortunate at this stadium have things like hyperbaric and sauna and red light therapy and all that stuff too. That stuff is absolutely great, but I was trying to think top tier a little bit more. What are the things that are, universally accessible to everybody? It doesn't matter whether you're making $50 million a year or they're making $500 a year. Like, everybody has the same access to sleep. So it's important just to make athletes prioritize it.
No, it's interesting that you highlight sleep. I had Pat Davidson on a while back, and we were talking about putting on muscle and hypertrophy. And, I asked him a similar question about supplements and strategies that he recommends, and sleep was top of his list too. And, I think it's probably the easiest thing for people to kind of pound their chest that they don't need, not realizing the significant impact it can have on, I think just about every training quality, but then also, skill development and retention, cognitive processing the next day. There's a lot of aspects of performance that are significantly improved by establishing quality sleep habits.
No doubt. And don't get me wrong, like, supplements absolutely have their place. I think a good vitamin D, fish oil, like, I'm a big AG1 guy. Like, you can fill in a lot of nutritional cracks with stuff like that, particularly if you're an athlete that's traveling quite a bit. So I think there's definitely a place where creatine, most research supplement history, works. You want to talk about sleep, like, there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that creatine actually improves cognition after like a night of sleep deprivation. So there may be a place for our athletes the morning after a terrible night in sleep to double or even triple their creatine dosage. So all those things are on the table. I was just, they're downstream for me. We got to have a conversation about lifestyle habits first. I think the other thing too is, like, when we talk about supplements, we talk about recovery initiatives. Like, what we're trying to do is we're trying to effectively recover from a stressor. Sometimes it's better to think way upstream and think about, like, what is the stressor, right? Is it argument with a significant other? Is it, some kind of other thing off the field that might be a challenge? Is it conflict with a teammate? It could be any of a number of different things. So, like, I think I'm more aware of that than ever before. It's like, hey, maybe this is someone who could benefit from talking to our mental conditioning department, or it's someone that just has noise. Like, how can I make that better for them? Particularly at the highest level of sports. Like, New York is a very big market. Like, there are a lot of our players who can't even go out to eat. Like, they can't leave their house because they're so recognizable. So I think sometimes, like, trying to figure out ways where, some of those guys just can't be on social media. Like, that's a stressor. Are you going to let it into your life, or are you going to block it out? Everybody is a little bit different in terms of how they can handle a large market. But I think, we're talking about at the highest level, but that stuff is prevalent for our college athletes, our high school athletes, or, our adult fitness clients. Like, everyone has some kind of stressor. Like, I know you're a parent, so you've probably heard about Maycember. Like, my wife, over the last 2 weeks, so 10 school days, has been invited to events at our daughter's school 8 days. And they're always like 10 a.m., 12 p.m. Today's like a presentation on, projects they did on a location in the state of Florida. Yesterday was step up to 5th grade. Last week was 2 separate Mother's Day events. Like, it's a stressor. Like, she's racing to work, and then she's like, I got to go do this. So it cuts my day in half. Like, that's a massive stressor that, no one would ever perceive. It's just like, all right, I lost 10 hours from my normal work week.
Yeah. We got a couple really good questions through Instagram for you that I want to throw your way. The first one, which I think you're in a unique position to answer, is just how you periodize programs for athletes that you have for, 6 to 9 plus months throughout the year, in season and off season. I think this is probably coming from the perspective of, people have these kind of set, like, all right, here's my 12 exercise progression, and I'm going to start with these phases that emphasize these areas. And when you have athletes year round and year over year, that may change a little bit. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, for sure. I would say, I'll give you the baseball calendar as a little bit of an example of, like, how periodization takes place. For context, like, we don't use linear periodization. We use what you would call more of like a, conjugate model, where there are different qualities that we want to prioritize at different times, but we are still training all those qualities. Baseball season basically ends at the end of September. If you're not a postseason team, guys generally have, 10 to 14 days where they're figuring out life. They're moving, they're, maybe going on a quick vacation, whatever it may be. So let's say guys start up October 15th and they're going to train all the way through, February 12th or so. So call it October to November, November to December, December to January, January to February. Your big league guys, you're going to get 4 months. You're hopeful of getting, 5 months with athletes. I've looked at it over the years. It's like a 19-week off season. You assume you're going to lose basically 3 weeks for holidays, travel on the front or back end, all that. So the goal is to get through 4 4-week blocks with our big league guys. And if we can get through 5 4-week blocks with our minor league guys, that's great too. Honestly, first month is I don't want to call it work capacity, but we've all seen the time, like, I guarantee you have guys that, go back home, like maybe they live in Washington State or something. You're back in Boston. They go home and they get their absolute butt kicked in the weight room. They're like, I'm in hockey shape. I'm just not weight room shape. They're very different, right? Baseball players, it's even more exaggerated because there's not the same kind of metabolic emphasis in baseball. So what we actually see in the first month of the off season as we integrate a fair amount of things, whether it's some isometric stuff to look at tendon health, whether it's classic weight room volume, a lot of mobility exercises. One of the things that we used to do was take a little break from like sprint work and med ball stuff and things like that. I actually think it's really important to preserve some of that elasticity. So I've done some of your classic 10 by 10s, tempo runs in that first month. The intensities are lower, but we still do it. What you see is guys, their initial force plate numbers go down the tubes in the first month. Like they redline and then they slowly come out of it around month 2, excuse me, because effectively you've imposed so much fatigue. You're trying to create effectively like a work capacity adaptation. And so I view that first month very much as let's recapture better motion. Let's build a good foundation of work capacity so that we can get everything that we need back. Month 2, we're going to start trending more towards attacking max strength a little bit harder. Some of those newbie gains as they come back are a little bit harder to get. So we are going to attack that a little bit more as we're continuing we're pushing some volume. All those guys continue to play catch. They may be back to hitting a little bit. Baseball's a little bit different now where guys used to shut down a lot more. More guys just continue to keep it moving in that regard, but the intensity is low enough that it's not going to interfere with your first couple of months. Month 3, you're starting to pull back. A lot of athletes will go from 4 days a week of lifting to you're building volume on a lot of your speed work, change of direction. You're throwing the med ball really aggressively, particularly as the throwing program starts to ramp up a little bit more. And then once you're rolling into January, the weight room volume's coming down. Maybe you're doing some complex training, French contrast training, something like that. Really, really big, particularly with our position players. In baseball, you're going to have to be on your feet 7 days a week doing some kind of speed stuff. So, whereas early in the off season, it might be like 3 to 4 days of like kind of just that reactive stimulus. We're up there at 5 and sometimes 6 for guys just so that they're comfortable with this being in cleats, having their Achilles, doing some stuff. Last thing you want is someone to show up spring training with a plantar fascia problem the first week because they haven't been in their cleats enough. So we definitely do more volume with our speed development stuff in the months of January into February than we had in the past. So big picture is like gradual build of maximal strength. And we know we've built a good foundation. We can pull back a little bit there. Obviously, we're on ramping the amount and intensity of classic plyometric stimuluses over the course of the off season. Some of the rotational stuff we might pull back because they're doing more throwing, more with hitting volume. So it is like a little bit of a shift. And then in season, it's hold on to the qualities that are most important to you. You're going to have athletes that are naturally very springy, and those are the ones you need to hold on to max strength better. You're going to have athletes that they're kind of slow, strong, and those are the ones where you're integrating some band assisted jumps. You're moving fast because they're going to hold on to all their force qualities really, really well. That said, that's an average model. If you have a 18th round draft pick who throws 88 to 90, who needs to gain velocity or is not going to stay in professional baseball, sometimes you turn some of those things upside down and you have to chase adaptation in different ways. So every conversation is unique in that regard, and we can always pivot accordingly.
Another question that I think is relevant to one of these discussions that the internet argument just keeps perpetuating all these years is just the pros and cons of quote unquote rotational versus anti-rotational training. And are those qualities that you emphasize at different points of the year, or are those things that you keep in balance throughout the year? What's your stance on that?
I think we use both. I think there's definitely a place for both. No different than like you're doing isometric hamstrings training followed by, single leg RDLs and, glider leg curls and all that stuff. Like there's definitely different ways to develop it. I think where I'm very leery about anti-rotation stuff is, if you're familiar with Bar Hartman's model, if you have like a compressed narrow ISA, or if you use like a TPI screen, like a lunge with extension test, and they literally have no lumbar extension because effectively their rectus is just so toned up that they're really, really pulled down. Like the external obliques, the rectus are just firing all cylinders all the time. And so they lose some of that motion. These are often the guys where like their 12th rib like sits right on top of their iliac crest. Like it's just, they're stuck right there. Their QLs are super dense and fibrotic and nasty. So I think those are the athletes where I'm a little bit less likely to integrate a lot of the anti-rotation, chops, lifts, bracing hard for rollouts and things like that. But you have to remember too, like all of our athletes are throwing baseballs, they're hitting, they're throwing med balls, they're doing a lot of other stuff that preserves a lot of that, classic spine mobility stuff. And they're also doing a fair amount of like unloaded things, like everything from reverse crunches to like there's spine rotation in a kettlebell arm bar. So like I think you're kind of playing for the tie if your programs are structured correctly. That said, if you're squat, bench, deadlift, and just go play your sport, it's probably not going to work out really well for you when you've got a weight room full of guys who all back squat 450, have back pain, and can't rotate.
What's your stance on foam rolling? That's another internet argument that won't go away too. That I always think like sometimes people get lost in the mechanisms and the research that is verifying or not supporting certain mechanistic changes, potentially ignoring the outcome itself, which, is favorable or not. So you have research supported mechanisms, but no meaningful improvement on the back end, or, we're still trying to figure out why something may work, but you have this favorable outcome. Where do you stand on foam rolling, and, has the timing or your strategies of using that changed at all?
I think people like to argue on the internet. I think we probably both agree with that. And they're typically the people that don't have any consequences to having a really strong stance like that, right? They're kind of like social media theorists. Here's a better question for you. If you walked into your weight room right now and you got rid of all the foam rollers, how's it going to go tomorrow morning when your team walks in and they're all looking for them? Like, you're going to get bearded. Same thing would happen for me. And it's not just that we made them foam roll. Like, a lot of those athletes had a decade of training experience at a high level before they met either of us, right? It's clearly something that they've thought helped in some capacity, whether it's a transient reduction in stiffness, maybe it's a change in fluid balance, maybe they're pressurizing their system differently. Do I think we're mechanically breaking down scar tissue? No. But what I do know is that in 2009, I saw Thomas Myers speak at Perform Better, and he made a comment. His presentation was about fascial fitness. And he said, we probably know about 25% of what we need to know about the fascial system, right? And then sure enough, 2020, when everything was shut down for COVID, MLB, kind of helped to put on this pretty cool like sports medicine lecture series. And Sue Falsone did a great presentation. It was on the same day as Dr. Greg Pearl, who's a big thoracic outlet surgeon, and Regan Wong from the Rangers. They were all talking about this stuff. And Sue presented some pretty cool, ultrasound imaging that basically showed before and after on dry needling and cupping, like how fascial layers glided over each other. And like the technology for assessing what happens following those interventions is getting better and better. And we're actually seeing like why people respond. I don't feel at all better after people dry needle me, but if you put a cup on me and you drag, I feel like $1 million. Changes my, the course of my next 2 to 4 weeks pretty substantially. So my takeaway is that athletes are pretty good at seeing through BS. Don't get me wrong, there's some that aren't. But at the highest level, they know what has contributed to their success, their ability to stay on the field. That's why it's so important to engage them in these conversations. So yeah, we still have foam rollers. The overwhelming majority of our athletes use them in some capacity. We've picked up some good rolling patterns from Bill that, actually use it more as a prop to create, rotation in various places, like you prop the left ilium and do a right step over to kind of reposition some stuff. So like, those things are all, kind of fluid, but there are a lot of athletes who just feel better by doing it. And I have no problem with letting them do so. I feel better when I do it too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I'm referencing when, so many people do it. So many people report feeling better afterwards. Let's work on explaining why later, but let's not throw them out just because we don't have a good mechanistic explanation of what's going on. And I'm not convinced that we don't, actually. I just think, to your point, the earliest proposed explanations probably don't hold as much water.
Yeah. And I mean, remember too, like we went to basically our entire, you and I both went to prestigious universities that told us lactic acid was the cause of muscular soreness, right? They died on that rooftop. And 5 years after we graduated, the New York Times was talking about lactate as a substrate for high intensity exercise. They were fundamentally wrong about a huge portion of exercise physiology. And it's like something that impacts everything you do every single day, right? You have to understand that in your world far more than I do. So I always come back to like, we don't know a lot of the reasons why what we do works. We got to lean on our athletes. We have to be, we have to have humility in our jobs because they can teach us far more than we could ever teach them.
Last question for you. This came in from a young woman that I know just wrapped up PT school. And, this is a topic that I've talked to Fergus Connolly about and some of our other colleagues that, I don't know that I would necessarily want to be, a young strength and conditioning coach coming through college right now where there's just so much information out there. It's harder than ever, I think, to prioritize and to understand where certain things fit in the bigger picture. Everybody, the marketing and the social media campaigns for certain things make it seem like everything is important. So, her question was so much information and education out there for coaches. How do you balance learning without drowning in it? And, I'm particularly interested in your take on this because I know you run a pretty robust internship program through CSP as well. And, I imagine that you have to navigate this situation a lot with young strength coaches.
Yeah, for sure. The information is really accessible. I was actually talking with Matt Blake about this. Matt's our pitching coach with the Yankees, and he was our first pitching coach at CSP. Like it's so much easier now to get access to the information. Like he was rating my bookshelf. Like we started CSP, like Instagram didn't exist. Like there was no TikTok. There was no any of this. Like you went to PubMed if you really wanted to nerd out, or you tried something and you figured out how it was worked. Like YouTube, what it was, it isn't what it was now. Like even Twitter, or now X, was not nearly as built out in terms of a resource for people. So you really had to do it a little bit more old school. And I actually think it was really good because what it forced you to do was spend a lot more time in the trenches trying stuff before you just rolled it out with athletes. I think now it's very easy to like look on your phone and then literally right into a program that month and take it outside. So it's a really hard time to be, a young coach like that. But that's why you seek out mentors. At the end of the day, you lean on people who have done it before, because they're going to teach you not to make the same mistakes that they made. Right. But on top of that, they're going to ask the discerning questions of you. Like, they're going to challenge you. And a good mentor doesn't just tell you how awesome you are and give you opportunities. Like they challenge you when you have what could be a really dumb idea, but they also challenge you when you have a great idea because you need to be able to defend it. So I always say, like, you have to have a rationale for every single thing that you put in a program, the volume you put it in for. And a lot of people just can't do that. So I think the number one thing that you can do if you're a young, enthusiastic person is, find a good mentor who help, you to kind of separate out, the good from the bad. And you just need to get a lot of reps coaching because you're going to realize there's a lot of stuff out there on social media that when you actually roll it out with a real live human that's in front of you, you're left without an outcome that you really wanted. So that's where I come back to, like, with our internships, to your point, like there's usually one or two interns where you got to pump the brakes and be like, you might have a lot of depth in this very specific portion of the world, but you don't have breadth of knowledge. And we always we see someone who's like, oh, this is a great hip mobility. This is going to fix it. I'm like, well, it's going to take away their low back pain. Well, what happens if they have a giant tumor in their spine? Like, you want to refer that one out. And so I think that's where I think it's just vitally important to have good mentors to stay, very, very humble. Surround yourself with people that challenge you. Like, you built a staff. I have as well, both at the facility and in pro sports. Like, the worst thing you can do is try to replicate yourself. You have to hire people that in some way complement your skill set and then ask the probing questions that make you reconsider whether what you're doing is a good thing. So I'm spoiled like that. I have a bunch of those people here. I have a bunch of those people in pro ball, and it's really served me well.
Yeah, you mentioned the accessibility of information. I mean, I think back to as an undergrad, I was going to the library, I was finding research journals on the shelves, and then I was spending literally every spare cent I had making copies page by page for hours and hours and hours. And, you'd park your horse outside the school library and then go in and, I'd walk out with a 3-foot stack of papers and try to sift through them all. And, now to your point, then you had to search for something. So you already had a question or, an area that you were pursuing where, now people are just flooded with information.
So here's the other thing I'll throw out there for you. And maybe this is a hot take. This will get you some clicks. So, right, what we hire based on competency and based on fit, right? Competency, like we can do a big interview. We can look at your academic preparation. We can go through all that stuff. Like, who's qualified to be a strength coach. Fit is the hard one, right? That's why we've always had just really, really good success hiring from our internships. We know who's like a quality human being that can actually interact with athletes. Here's what's really scary in today's, like 80% of the resumes that come in nowadays, everyone is a sports scientist. Like if you learned how to run a force plate or you took one course online, you're a sports scientist. And then what happens is you call and you check the references on that person and it's awkward. Their supervisor is like, listen, hard worker, like really smart. Like, we wouldn't let him talk to athletes. We had to hide him in the offices because he was so awkward in that world. Like, he just wasn't cool. And that's where, like, there's a lot of that in today's, up and coming strength and conditioning world. It's because people have spent too much time staring at computers and staring at phones when they should have been out having experiences, like putting in those hours and learning how to actually have good conversations with people. It's so vitally important. Like, I know we've probably had conversations about that over the years. It's really hard to evaluate fit until you've seen somebody actually coach.
Yeah, no. And I think that's a great point to highlight because, as somebody that, as you're working to develop your resume, I think it's kind of natural to focus on the certifications and, whatever your major was and minors were in school. And that's one of the first pieces of advice that I give people too, is like the quality of the experiences you have is going to outweigh literally everything else. Not just because of your personal growth and the opportunity to develop as a coach, but also you get jobs through recommendations from other people. And, to your point, if the phone call to the supervisor, like, oh, really bright kid, but, didn't want to come out of the office, or, was so awkward around other people that wasn't able to actually use the knowledge that they had, then, obviously that's not going to pan out.
For sure. It's a tough thing to teach, man. I'm sure you look back on how you were 15 years ago. I know I do. And it's like the awareness just wasn't there. It took a lot of time to get there. And I think that's hard because, like people want to go quickly. Like I've dealt with a lot. Like I was 25 when I gave my first talk on the Perform Better tour. Like it was a, I think to some degree I get maybe a lot more of these questions, and I just, I was right place, right time, and I worked really, really hard at it. Not everybody can kind of like do a lot of this stuff early in their career. Sometimes they need a little bit more time to marinate and just have the experiences.
No, for sure. I tell people when they reach out and say like, I want to work in pro sports, I say, good, like circle a date 10 years from now. Yeah. And then work on becoming as good as you can in between now and then, because there is kind of a race for the title without really understanding the work and the skill sets and experience you need to be successful once you get there.
Yeah. And then it's also a challenging industry. Once you get there, you might only be there for 2 years, and you don't realize that the travel is extensive. It's a lot of time away from family. So there's an opportunity cost to everything that you chase.
For sure. Well, Eric, this has been awesome. I know you have obviously tons of books, DVDs, online courses, resources, and share a ton of free material for people as well. Where's the best place for people to engage with all the great information you're sharing?
Probably just ericcressey.com. It's a hub for kind of all my stuff, and they can find the facility there. And then on social media, it's just at Eric Cressey. So I'm pretty active across Twitter and Instagram. Pretty accessible too if folks want to reach out. Appreciate you having me, buddy.
Of course. And then last thing, just because the CSP internship was career altering for me personally back in 2008. It's a long time ago at this point, but for the younger professionals that are looking for quality internship opportunities, what's the process for applying for one at CSP?
Yeah, for sure. All the information is available. It's cresseyperformance.com. There's an internship tab with, all the information you would need in terms of times of year and kind of like start dates and, application materials and stuff like that. But yeah, we're really proud of it. Like obviously we can shout the praises of guys like you who are doing amazing things out there. But I think just as importantly, it's a reminder, like we're not just a training facility, we're a teaching facility. So it's important for us to kind of like pay it forward and help to nurture the next generation of coaches. We've had some good success with it. But something that I love doing. I'm not the internship coordinator anymore. Back in the day, I was super involved with you, but I am still teaching now on a regular basis to the folks at our facilities.
Cool. Yeah, I can't recommend that highly enough.